Mark 6, beginning at verse 30. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a desert place and rest a while." For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a desert place in the boat by themselves. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away, that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks in hundreds and in fifties. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. Father, thank you that we have you, to turn to and to talk to, and that you are intimately aware of everything that's going on and intimately involved in all of it. And in this time of trial and heartache, when the tendency of a man's heart is to question you and ask you if you really know what the heck you're doing. And help us to resist that urge. Help us to just, in faith, lean on you and trust you and keep loving you, because you first loved us. I ask you to help me, as always, with delivering your word. What I got ain't much if you don't show up. We're not going to get anything out of this. So let your spirit fill this place, clear it of any evil that has found its way in, and just fill it to overflowing. This is your house. And all this we ask in the beautiful and blessed name of Jesus. Amen. So over the last 3 weeks, we've looked at 2 events. The first was the sending out of the 12 apostles with a message and authority. The message was, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And they, the 12, were empowered. They were given power from God, the same power dwelling in Jesus to heal all kinds of sicknesses, disease, infirmities, even the raising of the dead. And they were given authority over unclean spirits. The second event we looked at was the murder of John the Baptist at the hands of Herod Antipas. And both of those events affect how the event we are looking at today unfolds. So please keep both of those events in mind as a color or serve as a backdrop against which we can better understand this very well-known miracle of Jesus. This miracle is unique in that it is the only miracle done by Jesus that is recorded in all 4 gospel accounts. Nothing else. We're going to use, as we read, Mark's account as our base and add details from the others as we go along. Mark's account is the longest and most vivid telling of this event, thus the reason why I chose that as our base text. Now, if you remember, the bulk of Mark's gospel account is what he gleaned from Peter's preaching. Mark worked closely with Peter and transcribed what he had learned from him along the way. It is interesting that the apostle, who in most instances gives us the most concise or shortest accounts in so many other events, here gives us such full and encompassing retelling. It's very vivid the way he paints this picture. We have to conclude from that, that this event had a deep and lasting impact on Peter, so much so that he retold the event to others, preached it often enough and in such deep detail that Mark was able to gather this account from him. But as can be expected, each of the gospel writers gives unique details. Matthew's account in chapter 14, verses 13 through 21 is the shortest. While Matthew often delivers extensive accounts of Jesus' teachings, especially his deeper theological messages, here sticks mostly to the facts with fewer details. But as we've seen in so many other places, he does insert one fact that all the others forgot to include. Luke's account in chapter 9, verses 10 through 17 is similar in length to Matthew's account, but it also includes the two details not in the other accounts. Now, perhaps most surprising is that John the Apostle gives us an account of this event in his gospel as well. His account in chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. Now, John's gospel was written well after the other three, as many as 30 to 40 years after Luke's gospel was written. He knew that three narratives of this event were already in circulation, and yet he wanted to give his account as well. Having most likely read, and some of the church fathers tell us he had read the other gospel accounts, he still wanted to give his account too. This must have had a huge impact on everyone who saw it, everyone who was a part of it, everyone who witnessed it. It's hugely impactful. I believe it is one particular part of this event that spoke to each of the disciples in a different way. This one thing Jesus does, and the results of that action spoke to each of the gospel writers in specific ways. It compelled each of them to record this event from their own unique perspective. And in seeing this event from each writer's unique perspective, we get a very full and glorious glimpse of Jesus, of God in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, be forewarned, as is so often the case, I will not even come close to exhausting what can be gleaned from this event. In some cases, I'm just going to point stuff out and tell you to go home and think about it. That's what we have time for. Like he hasn't done that. Now, these events start in the city of Capernaum. From here, Jesus piles the 12 into a boat and heads out to the other side of the lake. Now, we are looking at Mark's gospel account, but we are actually going to start with 2 verses from Matthew's gospel. Then we will look at Mark's account and then also plug in verses from Luke's account. We need all three to get a complete picture of why Jesus piles his boys on board a boat and heads off to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So we start with 2 verses from Matthew's gospel. And before we go there, remember the backstory from last week. John the Baptizer has just been beheaded by Herod Antipas' guards, and his head is placed on a platter and given to Salome, who then presented it to her mother Herodias, whose plot had pushed Herod Antipas to kill John. So Matthew 14, 12, and 13. 12 in the first part of 13. Then his disciples, the disciples of John, came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. Now, Mark's account of the beginning of these events is this, Mark 6:30, 32. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, but what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while, for there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves." And finally, Luke's gospel tells us, in Luke 9:10, "And the apostles, when they had returned, told him all that they had done. But he took them and went aside privately into a deserted place belonging to the city called Bethsaida." So our narrative unfolds like this. It starts, Jesus has returned to his home base of Capernaum from being out ministering to all the villages in the Galilee region. It would seem that simultaneously, the 12 have returned from their first solo mission, and the disciples of John the Baptizer have also arrived to tell Jesus the news of his murder. It sounds like a day. Sounds like that day. If you remember back to the text from Matthew, when we were talking about the commissioning of the disciples, and I said it was a little vague as to whether or not they had actually been sent out, or he had just told them all this stuff. Well, this absolutely, the passages from Mark and Luke confirm that they absolutely were sent out on solo missions, because they're all coming back to tell Jesus, "Hey, guess what we did?" So the question here is, why did Jesus pile his boys into a boat and head off from Capernaum to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, specifically to a deserted place near the city of Bethsaida? There's one specific reason given, and two others that can be inferred from the text we read, and most likely the answer is all of the above. From Matthew's text, we are given the impression that Jesus wants some time away to mourn for John the Baptizer. And this is entirely possible, and it fits Jesus' character. Jesus is moved by human suffering, including death. John 1 tells us that Jesus is the very agent through which all of the cosmos came into existence. It was the hands of Jesus that formed man out of the dust. It was Jesus who breathed the spark of life into Adam. We were created to be immortal like him. Death was not supposed to be a part of the human experience, and it moved Jesus to his core to witness man succumbing to death. We will see this most vividly when his close friend Lazarus dies and Jesus weeps. See the effect it has on most of us. So Jesus is on the move here because he wants some quiet time to mourn the loss of John. The next reason Jesus launches out from Capernaum with his 12 is directly given by Jesus in this text. And he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest for a while," where there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. Jesus wanted to get away and have time to rest. Rest for him and rest for the disciples who had just returned from their first missionary journeys. If you ever doubted that Jesus was fully human, here's your proof. The human body Jesus is wrapped in is subject to the same need for rest as the rest of us are. The pre-resurrection body of Jesus was subject to the same trials of physical exhaustion that we are subject to. In all ways, he was tried and tempted just like us. The Bible both tells us this and shows it happening. This makes Christianity so unique. In every other religion, their deities are superhuman, always. It is only God who comes and dwells among his creation and voluntarily subjects himself to our weaknesses. Only God is strong enough to make himself that vulnerable. Now Luke tells us that the place Jesus sets off to is a deserted area near Bethsaida. I really wanted to bring a map, but it was huge and heavy. And then I looked at the little map, and it doesn't say what I want it to say. And so we're just going to go with Carl's magic flannel graph over here.
Just by Pinterest.
Yeah. So, Sea of Galilee, shaped kind of like a heart. Up here in the northwest corner is the city of Capernaum. Over here on the kind of kitty corner, not really across, but kind of cutting off the corner in the northwest corner, northeast corner. I'm sorry. Doesn't east and west flip when you go to the other side of the world? I was sure it did. And so I always get that messed up. So in the northeast corner is the city of Bethsaida. Bethsaida, Bethsaida is a small Jewish fishing village in the northeast shore of the Sea of Galilee. You may recall that this is the hometown of Peter, Andrew, Philip, and possibly Bartholomew. The reason why Jesus may have chosen to go here in particular, or to this general area, is found in Luke's account of the death of John the Baptizer, which we didn't read last time, but we're going to this time. Luke chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was done by him, Jesus, and he was perplexed, because it was said by some that John had risen from the dead. Actually, you know from other accounts that he was saying that, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the old prophets had risen again. Herod said, John I have beheaded, but who is this of whom I hear such things? So he sought to see him. So Matthew tells us that Herod Antipas is convinced himself that Jesus is John the Baptizer resurrected and come back to haunt him. So he is anxious to see Jesus. Somehow I believe that Jesus is aware of that fact. Although it does not say so, it is entirely possible that John's disciples brought this information along with telling them that John was dead. Jesus' choice of places to go indicates his awareness of Herod Antipas' desire to see him. How so, you may ask? Well, Capernaum is within the Galilee region, which is the domain of Herod Antipas. Bethsaida, while only a few miles away, just kitty corner across in the Sea of Galilee, is in the region of Galantis, which is ruled over by Philip the Tetrarch, which puts Jesus effectively out of the reach of Herod Antipas. Whether he is told by John's disciples or the Holy Spirit, Jesus' actions would indicate that he is aware that Herod Antipas wants to see him and perhaps has sent men out to fetch him. And so he simply removes himself from his jurisdiction until the threat passes. The last guy that Herod Antipas wanted to see didn't fare so well. Jesus knows this. It's not his time yet. So he does the prudent thing, and he just moves. He told his disciples, if there's too much persecution in one place, go to the next town. There's plenty of stuff to do over there. And as we see, there's a whole lot of stuff to do for Jesus when he gets there. And this is not the last time that we will see Jesus prudently leave an area when things get too hot for him there. In fact, it is a very illustration of something that Jesus had already told them. Matthew 10:23, when they persecute you in this city, flee to another. For assuredly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So Jesus sets off by boat from Capernaum to a remote area near Bethsaida in search of rest for him and his disciples, and to mourn the loss of his cousin and fellow kingdom worker John, and possibly to avoid being taken into custody by Herod Antipas. Dude's got a lot on his plate. Verse 33, but the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. Now John specifically tells us why the people followed Jesus around the lake. John 6:2 tells us, then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. So people recognized Jesus, the miracle worker, setting off from Capernaum, and they on foot run around the lake. And actually, it's not a huge distance, and if Jesus has got a little headwind, they could easily beat him, and they did. It's amazing. And they are standing there already waiting for the tired morning Jesus when his ship arrives on shore. Verse 34. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved compassion for them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. I really hope you were here 3 weeks ago and remember that very same phrase spoken by Jesus. Jesus tells us in John 6:2-3 that they're on a mountainside and that it is close to Passover. So this dates when this event takes place. It's the third Passover of the 4 Passovers in Jesus' ministry. So we're now approximately, not approximately, we're over 2/3 of the way through Jesus' life and ministry. But if you'll notice, we're probably maybe only 1/3 of the way through recorded history, and that's because so much of Jesus' story focuses on that last month, especially that last week. It's really heavily weighted on the end, and so we're about 1/3 of the way through Jesus' story, but we're well over 2/3 of the way through his total ministry. So Luke tells us this in Luke 9:11. But when the multitudes knew it, they followed him, and he received them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who had need of healing. And Matthew tells us this. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. We know for certain from the text that Jesus had set out to find a quiet place where he and the disciples could rest. And when he lands, there is absolutely no rest or quiet inside them. And this would have been, I know this would have upset me. Just came here, I can't take him when the dog won't leave me alone. And Jesus is physically tired and in mourning, and yet when he lands and sees the crowd waiting for him, he receives them. And that's that word that just takes them in. And that family, my family, is the nature of our God. He cares so much for those whom he created in his likeness and image that he, at his own expense, is willing to get down in the midst of us and work to relieve that suffering. And notice the language in Mark's gospel. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. And I do hope, as I stated before, that sounds familiar to you. It is the exact same language used at the end of Matthew chapter 9. After being rejected in Nazareth, Matthew tells us this. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved for compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered like sheep having no shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray that the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. This very thing, this very compassion of Jesus, was what prompted Jesus to commission, empower, and send out the 12 on their first missionary journeys. I've seen enough. I've seen enough suffering. I've got to get the word out faster. I've got to study. I think this is significant in that it ties the commissioning and empowerment of the 12 to this event. And I believe it factors into something Jesus is about to say. But twice we have seen that what truly moves the heart of Jesus, and thus by that we know it moves the heart of God. What tears at the heart of Jesus is the lostness of his people. The fact that they are wandering around as if they have no shepherd. The true source of this people's suffering, the source of all human suffering, is that man has turned away from God. They have stopped following the true shepherd. You cannot help but think of the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pasture. He leads me beside the still water. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Man's true problem is not what we think it is. We all got some idea, oh, if we just did. Man's true problem is that he stopped following his shepherd and is now wandering around lost in this world. Undoubtedly, you have heard about the tragic events of these last several days, and these people being gunned down, and you can talk all you want to about gun laws, and you can talk all you want to about what the president says and what our national discourse is and how we have to stop hate, but I can promise you none of this will truly ever end until people again start following their shepherd. Yeah. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do some of those things. What I'm saying is that the true answer to this problem is that we've stopped following the shepherd. The shepherd who leads us beside still waters and sets a table before us and takes care of us. Until we as a people, as a country, as a race, get back to following the shepherd, it's just going to keep getting worse. It really is. Verses 35 and 36. When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away, that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." So Jesus spends most of the rest of the day teaching these lost sheep about their greatest need, their need to turn to God and embrace his coming kingdom. And the disciples come to Jesus and urge him, "Hey, we've got nothing. These people need to eat. Gee, send them away." Some commentators I read go on for some time about how this shows the callousness of the disciples, and that they see this crowd as a burden while Jesus sees them as an opportunity. One went so far as to say that they wanted to pawn the obvious needs of the crowd off on the surrounding communities rather than try and meet the need themselves. I'm like, really? Where did you get all that from? Wow. That makes for a good sermon about how we should see those who come to us for help and should give of ourselves to them as Jesus did, but I don't really think that this text supports that conclusion. I think the disciples coming to Jesus is very practical. I don't think that it implies any overt callousness on their part. What it does show us, though, is that they are stuck in the natural. They see a crowd in need of food and they look around and practically conclude, we don't have the resources to meet their need, so what's the next best thing we can do? We can send them away. They are seeing things in natural terms, in the terms of what they can do in their own power, and Jesus wants them to see things in a different way. What happens next is a message to the disciples. But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" Matthew tells us this little more that Jesus said. Matthew 14:6. But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." You give them something to eat. I thoroughly and completely believe Jesus literally, absolutely means that. You feed them. Well, let me phrase it differently. You can feed them. Why do I say this? Because of all the events that led up to this. Jesus had sent them out to spread the news and gave them power to do miracles. They were given power over all forms of sickness and over demons. Jesus told them to raise the dead. If they could do all that, if they could raise the dead, rustling up some dinner, even for a lot of people, just shouldn't be that hard. If they were depending on God to raise the dead through them, coming up with dinner shouldn't be this stressful. The scene opened with them returning to report all that God had done through them while they were on mission, and yet here's an opportunity to do something else miraculous. And instead of leaning into the supernatural power that they were given, they resort back to what they know, the natural. At the very least, why wouldn't they come to Jesus and say, hey, these people need to eat. How do we do that? How do we do this, Lord? How do we feed these people? Because they need to be fed. But they don't even think that way. They've overlooked the supernatural power of God to meet human need and fallen back to thinking purely in the natural. They are looking simply at what they can do in their own power and not past that to see what God can do. I believe that is at least one, if not maybe the main reason this miracle had such an impact on all of the gospel writers, because it showed the enormity of what God desires to do through them. First to meet man's spiritual needs, and then with provision from above meet their physical needs as well, and he can do it with nothing more than what they already have on hand. What ensues after this is an almost comical exchange between Jesus and his disciples. The conversation begins when Philip making this comment to Jesus, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? John's gospel tells us the rest of the conversation. Keep in mind that a denarii was an entire day's wage for most common people. That's what you get. You went, you did your day's labor, they gave you a denarii and sent you home. So John 6:5-7. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that they may eat? Even if you had 200 denarii, where are we going to go buy that much bread? Bethsaida is a really small fishing village, and it's. But he said, but this he said to test him, for he knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have just a little. So Jesus is like, Philip said, let's go buy $200 worth of bread. And Jesus is like, what's $200 worth of bread? Where are you going to get that? And Philip's like, well, yeah, and even if we got $200 worth of bread, they're only going to get, like a quarter of some crust each. We're going to have to pass out crust and dough balls. And the conversation shows that these men, despite all they have seen Jesus do and all that God had just done through them, are purely focused on the natural and not looking to their God who can do anything supernaturally. And I'm not picking on them, because I'm having one of those days right now where I see what's going on and I'm like, all right, do I do this or do that or do that? And I'm trying so desperately to go, okay, God, what are you going to do? And so I'm not picking on them, I'm just pointing it out. Verse 38, but he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. John's gospel again fills in some interesting details of what happened here. John 6, 8, and 9. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, and we can go into a long time about Andrew, and he has this tendency to bring people to Jesus. Said to him, there is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many? Now, I'm going to digress for a minute here. Some have tried to base on these verses in John to spiritualize this into a practical miracle rather than a supernatural act. The story, I think, goes something along this lines, is that everybody really did have food, and they were greedy and selfish and hiding it up their sleeves or in their shirt, and they were afraid that if they pulled their food out, they'd have to share it. So when this wonderful little boy offered to give his lunch, and I'm not saying what he did it's awesome, we're going to talk about it. But when this little boy offered to give his lunch, and Jesus was going to split up just a little crumb to everybody started pulling out their food, and suddenly there was enough to go around. Seriously. It was actually, I'd heard it before, it was in one of my commentaries, and I'm like, wow. John, and they take this, and they teach this out of John's account, because it's the only one that talks about the lad with the loaves and fishes. And John's account doesn't support this. And when you look at the whole counsel of God, all 4 accounts, it just doesn't hold water. The people had seen Jesus in a boat, heading across the lake, and dropped what they were doing and ran ahead to meet him. Nobody stopped to pack a lunch. They were eager to get to him. It was not like Jesus had planned this event and posted flyers all over Galilee. This wasn't a pre-planned all-day Jesus Festival concert. It was a spontaneous gathering. This lad with 5 loaves and 2 fish is the only one who had food because he probably had to go ask his mother permission to go after Jesus. And being a good Jewish mother, she said, yeah, you can go, but you're going to need some food. And he's sitting there tapping his foot, Mom, I need to go. And she's packing up a lunch for him. He said, I got to carry this. Can I at least have my Spider-Man lunch bag? She said, no, just go. Take the basket. Go. It's the only reason this one boy had food. Everybody else was just in a hurry to go. When you doubt the divinity of Christ and the power of God to do the seemingly impossible with practically nothing, when you see Jesus less as the incarnation of God and more as a good teacher and a model of moral principles, you come up with these kinds of explanations for what the text plainly shows as a supernatural miracle wrought by the finger of God through his servant, Jesus Christ. It is a good lesson. Teaching people not to be selfish and share is a good thing. And Jesus taught those things. But this isn't the text for that. And when you stretch the text to fit what you're going to teach, it's just wrong. And in this case, you diminish the power of God in Jesus to accomplish your seemingly well-intended goal of teaching about selfishness. You have to reduce the power of God to fit your moral teaching. It's just not worth it. One last thing to note here is these were barley loaves. This is poor people's food. Barley flour was the roughest, nastiest, grainiest. Now you'd pay extra for it. But back then, people considered it disgusting. This is not what we choose. Now people go and buy bread made out of sawdust and horse feed, and it's gourmet. Back then, people didn't think so. This was poor people food. This is not the finely ground wheat flour like you and I think of today. And these fish, they were salted fish. These weren't fresh. Nobody started up a fire, roasted. They were small, and the text tells us. Some of the commentaries, they said, my brain struggles to write it. They weren't much bigger than sardines, and they were actually meant to be more of a condiment on the bread. It's not much. And Andrew, in the natural, was very right to say, what are these among so many? This was not enough to fill up one decent-sized grown man, let alone an army of people. But as we will soon see, when placed in God's hand, the seemingly insufficient is more than enough. Verses 39 and 40. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks in 150. So why would Jesus so meticulously set out the people in this fashion? I believe it's because he wanted an accurate account, straight up. He wanted them to know. He wanted his disciples to know exactly how miraculous what he was about to do really was. truly believe this miracle is all about the disciples and showing them that when they are willing to look to God and place all that they have in His hands, that He will do unbelievably amazing things with it, far over and above what their actual need is. Verse 41. And when He had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, He looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to His disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish He divided among them all. I don't know what the mechanics of this is. The movie that came out not too long ago, Son of God, it was part of this whole series in the Bible series. In that movie, Jesus has all the food in a basket, and He raises it up to the sky and blesses it, and when He comes down, there's like 1 billion fish and tons of bread. And it could have been like that, but it says He raised it up to heaven and broke it. And so in my mind, and I could be completely wrong, He's just got, and He just keeps peeling it off, and filling up a basket. You go, filling up a basket. And no matter how much He peels off, it's just, yeah, it is. It's everlasting. Gobstopper. These are the things that I sit around and think about. And this is the event that I believe had the next biggest impact on the disciples. Jesus blessing the bread and then breaking it and feeding thousands of people with it. It would invoke a remembrance of the past, for in it we see the children of Israel gathered in the deserts of Sinai, and each day God provided bread for them in the form of manna. It would also invoke memories of Elijah and the widow. And Elijah was sent to the widow, and she's, would you give me some water and some food? I got enough for 1 cake, and then we're going to lay down and die. And Elijah's like, no, give it to me. And God says, it won't run out until the rain comes again. This would have greatly moved Matthew, who does the most complete job of showing the continuity of the Old Testament scriptures in the life of Jesus. And this event, in his eyes, just had to be part of my gospel. It has to be there. Because I see God sitting there feeding the people on this mountainside, just like He did the children of Israel in the desert. In it we see a looking forward to the Last Supper, where Jesus would similarly take bread, bless it before God the Father, break it, and distribute it among His disciples and tell them that this is my body broken for you. This would have moved the hearts of the gospel writers as they were writing after both of these events took place, and they could not help in hindsight not see one event foreshadowing the next, the Last Supper, and thus this event must have been included. We've just got to put this in. It's got to be there. It's got to be there. And it looks further still to the marriage feast of the Lamb, where Jesus will once again set His people down before Him and serve us, His beloved bride, a meal unlike we have ever had before. John was given a vision of the book that became the book of Revelation, where this prophecy is told before he wrote his gospel account. He could not help but see how similar the two events were, and thus, this has got to be in my gospel too. It's got to be here. It's that important. Beyond the invoking of so many similar pictures, Jesus here is modeling a truth that He wants His disciples to see and understand. It does not matter how meager what you have on hand is. It does not matter how ill-equipped you think you are for a given task. When you look to God and put it all in His hands, He will take it and make it everything you need and more. Verse 42. So they all ate and were filled. And so it was. People did not just get some food. They ate until they were full. All 4 accounts say the same thing. They ate until they were filled. Nobody walked away that day hungry. Verse 43, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. John's Gospel gives us some interesting details in verses 12 and 13, chapter 6. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost. Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. So Jesus specifically tells the 12 to gather up everything left over. He didn't need to do that. He had just produced food for 5,000 out of practically nothing. If he needs food in the future, is Jesus teaching them waste not, want not? Perhaps it's a good thing to teach, but I think it is far more likely he wanted him to see that God had not just met their need, but far exceeded it. Just like he made them sit down in 50s and 100s, so there was an accurate count. Jesus is trying to show the disciples something. And I think this may also strengthen the picture of the children of Israel in the desert being provided for by God. They picked up the 12 baskets, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. It was God who supernaturally provided for the children of Israel in the desert. Here it is. Jesus doing the very same thing. I believe he is showing them that he is God. Just like God did this for the people of Israel in the desert, I can do the same thing because I am God. Verse 44, now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. As was the custom in those days, only the men were counted. So we do not know the exact number of people fed that day. As if 5,000 wasn't a big enough number in and of itself. But it is highly likely that the count with women and children included was in the neighborhood of 10,000 plus. Easily. The little boy who showed up with the food, the only smart one in the bunch, wouldn't have been counted. So we know there was at least 5,001 people there. So what can we take away from this? There's a bunch. I'm going to pick 3. First, God's compassion for the human condition starts with our lostness. We are like sheep without a shepherd. We are just wandering around aimlessly. Some days we feel it, and some days we don't. But the fact is we are wandering around aimlessly. We have no true direction or purpose that will actually benefit our immortal soul. We flit about seeking to satisfy our natural needs and urges and live in almost total ignorance of what is truly most valuable, spiritual rebirth. But that concern for our lostness is all-encompassing. We need a shepherd. What does a good shepherd do? He provides everything a sheep needs. Green grass to eat, still waters to drink from, shearing in the spring so that we are not overcome by the summer's heat. A good shepherd monitors the sheep's health and administers treatment when it is ill. A good shepherd administers discipline to keep the sheep from wandering off where it can be preyed upon by wolves or fall off a cliff. His people had gathered and sat at Jesus' feet to listen as he taught them about the kingdom of heaven. He was first feeding them spiritually, and it says he healed those among them that needed healing. And finally, he could have sent them off, as his disciples had suggested, to find ways to meet their most basic needs, something to eat. Head out. You're good. But he didn't. He sat them down and fed them by his own hand. God's concern, his compassion for our needs is truly all-encompassing, going from the spiritual first and then to the physical, from the extraordinary need for healing from disease and injury, all the way down to our most basic need for something to eat. So God's concern for his compassion on human beings is all-encompassing. Two, when we are faced with an insurmountable task, do we look to our own abilities or do we look up? The disciples desire that disciples, despite having been endued with power from Jesus, when faced with a seemingly impossible task, look no further than the limits of their own resources. Again, I'm not picking on, just pointing it out because it speaks to me. They focus completely on their natural abilities, and the point of this miracle, at least as it pertains to the disciples, was to get them to look vertically when faced with a challenge rather than horizontally. Challenges are specifically meant to bring us to the limits of our own abilities so that we will look to God for provision. And last, God can do unbelievable, overwhelmingly unthinkable, amazing things with what we consider to be virtually useless. If we will take whatever resources we have been given already, no matter how meager they are, and put them in God's hands, He can bless it and do something unimaginably glorious with it. So what resources do you have? What talents has God given you? I see people around us giving those talents in Jesus' name. I don't mean to embarrass you in the very least, but my beautiful adopted mother, Lucy, sits in the back, and she has this ability to turn useless plastic grocery bags into bags that can be filled with supplies and given to homeless people. And I see people.
$15 one today.
Wow.
And I see people like Tammy Kynes on the board over there who, I don't know exactly what her means is, but I see week after week her putting everything she has into God's hands. And week after week, He keeps making sure there's enough to feed everybody that comes through that line, sometimes more than once. And then, I look at me. I still don't know how I got here. I still don't have any idea why I'm sitting up here. When I came to Jesus, I didn't know nothing about the Bible. And what I did know was really whacked. It was not good. It really was. Jesus had seriously unlearned some things for me. And a little while later, I'm in Israel. I get this idea that boy, it would sure be awesome to be with people like you guys that I was on the trip with, where we could really share Jesus and really get into the Word, and it'd be Spirit filled, and it would be saturated with the Word of God. And then I'm sitting here, and I still don't know how it happened. I didn't come into this with nothing. And some of you are going, you still got nothing. But, and you'd be right, because week after week, God puts me up here and He does something, and I hope it touches you, and I hope it's amazing to you. But God can take me and do something that perhaps touches you now and then. Of all the resources we have, that most valuable resource, it's just that it's our life. And that's the resource Jesus is really most after. And maybe you'd say, I got a pretty good life. I'm doing okay. Why would I need to put my life in God's hands? Because this life, your life, no matter how good it is momentary. And the end of it, without Jesus, is destruction. The Word says so. But God can take this temporal life that you think is pretty good and make it an instrument of glory. And the end of that life is eternity in the kingdom of heaven. And those you consider your life a train wreck, God is eager and willing to do the exact same thing for you if you will put your train wreck of a life completely into His hands. The being that spoke and brought light out of nothing and caused the cosmos to come into existence from nothing by the sheer force of His will can take your life, no matter how messed up it is, and turn it into something glorious. So I'm going to leave you with two questions to two different groups of people. If you don't know Jesus, if you haven't given your life to Jesus, will you? He is eagerly waiting for you to find your life by giving it up to follow Him. Surrender your life to the Good Shepherd. He will provide for you every need. And turn whatever life you give Him into something glorious. And for those of you who have given your life to Jesus, what else are you willing to surrender now? Will you give Him even your most meager resources? This one thing I'm holding back, because if I give it up, I'll have nothing. A little boy had a long way to go to get home and short legs to get there. And he gave up what he had. Jesus, will you surrender your time? Will you give your talents? Will you give your money to Him? And it does not matter how ruddy and insufficient those resources may be. In His hands, when He blesses what you have brought to Him, it can multiply and accomplish things that you never dreamed of. You could wind up sitting in front of a Wednesday night church service teaching. You just never know. With that, would somebody open us in prayer, please?
Lord, we just, more than anything, thank you for your word. Thank you that it's here for us. It's that scripture, I think it's in Isaiah